So welcome to this third session of the GLO eHero special sessions. We have three presenters in this session. We have Kelsey O'Connor, we have Alberto Prati, and we have Robin Konieczny. And in these special sessions, each presenter has a discussant who has already read their paper and has 5 minutes to provide some comments on the paper. And then if there's time, we open the floor for a general discussion. So now the first presentation is by Kelsey O'Connor, and the discussant later on will be Robin Konieczny. So the floor is yours, Kelsey.
Yeah, and again, please let me know if I'm, hitting 15 minutes or whichever time you'd like to start.
Yeah, we'll tell you 2 minutes before.
Yeah, 2 minutes, okay. So I think you're all familiar with the Easterlin Paradox. I know some of you have contributed to work on it before. So what we're trying to do today is just add some further clarification and some new evidence. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm a former student of Richard Easterlin, and I was really honored to participate in this new handbook chapter, and then he asked me to give the presentation. So I was happy about that. All right, let's get started with an example. Oh, I need to click here. There we go. We need further clarification and evidence. And here we can look at the views of Robert Barrow, Nobel laureate, in the well-known paper by Stevenson and Wolfers, Economic Growth and Subjective Well-Being, Reassessing the Easterlin Paradox. So he says here that happiness and income levels are correlated makes sense. This is in reference to the Stevenson and Wolfers findings. However, if the results indicated otherwise, he would conclude that either the data or the methods were flawed in some way, not that there's no relationship between happiness and income. So here's a Nobel laureate who's an empirical economist saying that he would ignore the evidence if it didn't confirm his previously held beliefs. So this is one of the reasons why we need some further clarification and evidence, related to the paradox. But to be precise, let's define the paradox. So here, this is a recent definition that will come out in the new dictionary. The Easterlin paradox is the contradiction between two empirical income happiness relationships. So countries that have higher GDP per capita are on average happier, but over time, countries with greater GDP per capita growth do not experience greater increases in happiness, right? So it's the contradiction between these two relationships. So a lot of people refer to the paradox, let's say, imprecisely thinking about just this GDP per capita growth or the time series aspect of the paradox. But in fact, it's the contradiction between the two sets of findings. So I see there's somebody in the chat now. So what I'll do is I will come to questions at the end. However, if somebody has a burning, clarifying question, I'm happy to take it. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and stop me. We'll look at some examples to illustrate this. So here's the classic cross-sectional relationship. On the left, you have mean life satisfaction. Across the bottom, you have per capita GDP on a logarithmic scale. You see this positive linear slope here. And notice the title. It says that each doubling of GDP is associated with a constant increase in life satisfaction. So here's another Nobel laureate, in this case, Cengiz Deaton, inferring from cross-sectional relationship, cross-sectional data, time series relationship. Another reason why we need to further illustrate, provide evidence for the Easterlin paradox. So here's a time series relationship. United States, 1970s to 2010s, I think it's 2015. And, GDP per capita, adjusted for inflation, nearly doubles. Yet happiness is fairly flat. So this is something that I think you're all familiar with, but just helpful to illustrate the difference between, the cross-section time series. And this harks back to Easterlin's original findings, which related to the United States. All right, so continuing on with the definition. So as you know, Easterlin first documented this in 1974, but since he's added to the definition, so he and colleagues clarified that it's the trends of GDP per capita and happiness that are unrelated, while short-run fluctuations are positively related, for example, during recessions. we know during the Great Recession or, the financial crisis, also to some extent during COVID-19, that the declines in GDP are associated with declines in happiness. So we'd call these the short-run fluctuations, not the trends. To further illustrate this and to kind of set up our overall conceptual background, what we're thinking about, this figure is quite helpful. So note here on the left, you have both income and happiness. Across the bottom, you have time now. And you have two trends. So you have income and happiness here. And you can see when you move from peak to trough, there is a corresponding movement between the two series. However, when recovering from the trough in income, you have a larger increase in, when income recovers from the trough, you have a larger increase, and happiness maintains, it goes back just to where it was before, maintaining a similar level. So you see that the trends over time are distinct, but the short run fluctuations are similar. So it's, but important to distinguish here, right? So if we believe that, income is going to lead to better lives, better, let's say in subjective terms, then income should have a lasting impact on happiness, or GDP should have a lasting impact on happiness, not just one of short run fluctuations. So it's, conceptually important to, look at these trends, not just the short run fluctuations. So yes, it makes sense to avoid the impact of recessions, but over the long run, we need to look at the trends of these two. Okay, that brings us to the new evidence. So what does it look like? So here we go back to the European Values Study and World Values Survey kind of body of data. It gives us the largest cross-section of countries with a long time series. And note here that the country groups have been broken out into 4. So we have the transition countries from the former communist countries, and then they're broken into 2 groups. So expansion-only countries are countries in which we first observed life satisfaction after the fall of communism, and the full cycle countries, Hungary is a good example, where we have data actually going back into the 1980s. And so we can see both the collapse and the recovery. Okay, less developed countries are fairly straightforward. And then, going back to the transition countries, you see here that GDP per capita and life satisfaction both grew at much greater rates than any of the other countries. Less developed are still fairly fast in growth, GDP growth, but much more than the full cycle and life satisfaction. So they're really distinct countries, and this is because they are only the series is only covering the expansion after the fall of communism. Note that the long time series. Also, I like to point out that in each country group, life satisfaction is actually increasing. So it's not that life satisfaction is flat, as some authors pointed out, or like the United States example earlier. So what does the relationship look like? So here we are looking at along the left, the annual change in life satisfaction. And then across the bottom, the GDP growth rate, again, in annual terms. So you have changes and changes, long run changes. And the solid line is the relationship in all of the countries, excluding these expansion-only transition countries. And you see that it is fairly flat. And the statistical significance is presented in the paper. It's insignificant statistically. However, when you add in the expansion-only transition countries, you can see that a bulk of them are above the line, and it's going to shift up the curve here. So we have now a statistically significant relationship, but it's due to these countries which have faster growth rates in both GDP and life satisfaction. So when you look at the relationship in let's say the long run relationship in the set of countries really reflects that, you see an insignificant relationship. It's only when you add these others that you see it's something significant, which is part of the reason why you might see differences in some critiques of the paradox, of the long run time series part. And you know, what's interesting here is it's not that these countries actually have a positive relationship themselves. So here we look at each country group independently, and you see, in fact, these expansion-only countries actually have a negative relationship between GDP growth and life satisfaction growth. And each country group here has a negative relationship, except the developed countries, somewhat surprisingly. However, it's quite small, as you can see. So in the World Value Survey, European Value Study, so it's our largest set of countries with a long time series. There's no statistically significant relationship between growth and life satisfaction in the long run. Part of what we did, though, for this new handbook chapter is we added in the Gallup World Poll. So here you can now see that we have quite a bit more countries, especially in the less developed group. You can see the growth rates again. So actually the growth rates are a bit higher. Note that the Gallup World Poll data, right, they start in 2005. So we have a shorter time period, but this is still a bit longer than one business cycle typically. The expansion-only countries or transition countries, they're all measured post-communism. So they're still a bit recovering, and you can see the faster growth rates evident there as well. So we'll also distinguish them in the analysis. So here's a figure displaying that. You see that when looking at just the developed countries and the less developed countries, again, it is a somewhat flat. Now it's a little bit positive relationship. And then adding in these transition countries, the relationship tilts up a bit. And you can see, again, part of it is because they have this, both faster growth of life satisfaction, or in this case, it's the Cantrell ladder, best possible life, and GDP. Breaking it out into the individual countries, we see, actually what I think is most startling is the line in the less developed countries is nearly flat. So a lot of people still think that growth has a positive impact in on life satisfaction in the less developed countries, but this results suggest otherwise. And there are 75 countries in here. So I admit that if you were to look at say the least of the less developed countries, the results may be different. But given our a fairly standard definition, using the definitions we've been using, there's no relationship here. And in fact, the relationship is steeper in the developed countries and even more in the transition countries, contrary to what we saw in the previous World Value Survey data. However, this relationship is still not very economically meaningful. So if we look at the coefficient, which is it's going to be in the handbook chapter in the table notes, which, by the way, isn't yet available, but there are working paper versions. So the coefficient here is actually still just a 0.01, which doesn't mean much yet. But to interpret that, it would still take 100 years for 1 percentage point increase in the growth rate to raise happiness by 1 point. And 100. So I think this is fairly, it's not very meaningful. And that's the steepest curve that we've got among all of the relationships that we've found. So statistically significant or not, there's no meaningful relationship here. And that's one of the new ways of thinking about this. So there's Edsel-Beha points this out quite clearly in a previous paper that, and there's also, I just forgot the name of this, I forget the name of this other author who helps us to think about the difference between economic meaningfulness and statistical meaningfulness. So Beha, is quick to point out, though, even if you find a statistically significant relationship, that doesn't mean that, it's not strong evidence to reject the paradox. Okay, so discussion. So greater GDP per capita growth rates are not meaningfully associated with greater changes in happiness in the long run. And this is within any of the country groups, including the less developed countries. And even the largest magnitude, it would still take 100 years for a 1 percentage point increase in GDP per capita growth to raise happiness by 1 point. So what's the explanation? And so many of you are quite familiar with, let's say, adaptation, among other aspects. But what we're looking for is an explanation of both the cross-section and the time series finding. So, and the best one seems to be social comparison, which is nicely illustrated here. So you see this young boy who, although has a dessert, the dessert is just incomparable to his friend's large ice cream cone. So this illustrates, at least in some cases, it's not the absolute amount that matters, having an ice cream or a popsicle or not, but the relative impact that matters. So if we look at this, in a fairly basic mathematical framework, here imagine that you have happiness depending upon the log of income, of your own income, happiness also depending on the log of reference income. So reference being, a peer group or possibly your own past levels of income. But we'll just take it as the peer group, in this case, reflecting social comparison. So in the cross-section, we have a positive coefficient on beta. So those who earn more are indeed happier. However, when we look at this over time, let's say economic growth that's equally distributed is going to cause income and reference income to increase at the same rate. And then we have beta 2. So this is reflecting that, image before that, what others have is undercutting our own experience. It's so that, and in this case, undercutting the benefits of economic growth. So if they are relatively equal in magnitude, just opposite signs, then income growth is going to have no meaningful impact on happiness. And there are seminal contributions both by Easterlin, but also Clark and his co-authors. So in that case, he's actually, and there are others who are looking at the micro data, not just looking at the macro data, which I have presented here. So my conclusion, and I have some additional slides depending on time, but just to give you the most important aspects, is the evidence, when appropriately considering the trends of happiness and GDP, has been consistent over the past nearly 5 decades of research, from 1974 on now to 2021. GDP alone does not contribute meaningfully, if at all, to happiness in the long run. This is now based on more than 120 countries. However, it does not mean that happiness is flat, as I pointed out in our data, which, so the original paradox paper was written on the US, where happiness was flat. I showed you an image where happiness is flat in the US. But in the other countries, it isn't. So that raises the question, of course, when does and or what causes happiness to increase? So I think this is the more important question than about growth. One contribution here is from my colleague Francesco Saracino, and he finds that economic growth does relate to greater happiness when social capital and income equality are stable or improving. So he's looking at essentially, interaction terms here, or conditions in which growth is positive. Easterlin doesn't talk about growth in another paper at all. He just focuses on other determinants, finding that full employment and safety net policies do increase happiness. And this is part of my additional slides if we want to discuss these evidence here. And my final conclusion would be, for the moment, as somebody who's still getting my legs underneath me in the research field, I think we can easily say we need to just better metrics of well-being than GDP. So that's that. I don't know how much time I have left, Martijn.
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey. Exactly in time. So then we move over to the discussant.
Okay.
So then you can stop sharing it. Yeah. And then
Yeah, so,
Milena will actually be your discussant.
Yeah, I will be the discussant based on, so this is a joint presentation, let's say, with me and Robin. So, how much time do I have, Martijn?
5 minutes.
5, okay, yeah, so then, Yeah, this is a really, really great chapter. And I actually want to start with, to me, the biggest paradox is how many people actually get the Easterlin Paradox incorrectly. I see this on average once a day, and that's not just students, that's also academics. So I'm really, really happy about this chapter. And I really thank Dick and Kelsey for writing this chapter and for clearing the confusion. So there have been a couple of other papers by Dick that also do the same thing, but I think that this chapter really does a great job in providing also the latest evidence on the topic. I consider the chapter a must read for all of us. And if you're considering teaching, please consider including this chapter in your reading list. It's really well suited for that purpose, and actually had some master students read it, and it helped a lot. It's very well written and accessible, and Kelsey presented this main conclusion already, but I think this is the clearest way in which I have seen the results of the Easterlin Paradox being put in a perspective. So if you increase the GDP of a country by 1 percentage point, it would take 8,000 years to raise happiness by 1 point. So I think that's at least to me, this is the best way to put the results of the Easterlin Paradox in perspective. So I haven't seen this done elsewhere. So the chapter does a good job in explaining that. I want to highlight, so Kelsey talked about that, but I want to highlight that one great aspect of the chapter is that it provides evidence on Eastern Europe. Usually these transition economies are in analysis, they're swept under the rug, so they are often either excluded from analysis of the Easterlin Paradox or used as some sort of proof against the paradox. So I really appreciate the careful analysis in the chapter that actually helps us realize what is going on there by providing analysis for expansion only and full cycle countries. So if you're wondering what happened in Eastern Europe after communism fell until the mid-1990s, essentially, life satisfaction and income fell both dramatically. And then after the mid-1990s, income started to improve, but life satisfaction also improved, but at a slower pace compared to income. Like I said, the chapter does a very careful job in separating the expansion-only countries, so countries here that you have evidence from, let's say, the mid-1990s onwards, from those that are so-called full-cycle countries, so you have data before their economic collapse. And actually, to test the paradox, you need the full cycle countries in addition. So Kasper Kaiser was also asking about that. And I thank Kelsey and Dick for providing this evidence in the chapter. So you saw this here, but so whether or not you include these countries matters. And the conclusions that you draw also differ whether you include them or not. And as Kelsey showed, actually, if you only do the full cycle countries, the relationship could even be negative. So all of these things went really great. Since this is already a chapter that has been accepted and I was the section editor, I just want to provide some general remarks about the Easterlin Paradox. I think that we need a little bit more precision in general. This is not specific to the chapter, but I think as a happiness economist, we need to be more careful when we talk about the paradox. Yeah, so one thing that we should do a better job of is to provide clear definitions of the short, medium, and long runs. Yeah, what is that in terms of years? So the chapter of Kelsey and Dick does a good job in doing that, but in general, we're quite sloppy. And part of it is because of data limitations, but we need to be clear of what these things mean. We also need precise definitions of happiness and income. So for example, in the medium and long run, What do we mean? How do we measure the average annual change exactly? So are we measuring that based on the beginning and end period values and averaging that, or are we averaging based on each observation that we have and not just the beginning and end periods? Are we using differences in logs, for example, when it comes to income? Are we talking about hedonic happiness or affect, or are we talking about life satisfaction? So more precision on that. And a lot of people are actually not aware, but the Easterlin Paradox is about the unconditional relationship between happiness and income. And many papers throw in control variables or country fixed effects, region fixed effects, etc. Time fixed effects, and try to provide evidence about the Easterlin paradox. So, but we need to be more precise whether we're talking about the conditional or unconditional relationship, and whether we include country dummies or region dummies, time dummies, etc. So I think that one paper that I recently saw is that, which was this might seem a bit silly, but one paper that I recently saw was using perceived income and studying the relationship between perceived income and happiness, and claiming that that paper was about the Easterlin paradox. So we need to be more precise in saying that it's about actual dollar or euro amount or whatever, and not perceived income. And then when it comes to the explanations of the paradox, these are typically done using individual level data from high income countries. This is something that Kelsey and Dick talk about in the chapter. But so what about the more macro level explanations, and what about using data from other countries? So with the Gallup Road Poll, that would be possible. My slides here are somehow not in the order in which I want them to be, but I think we also need to show more systematic evidence about the within country evidence about the paradox. A lot of the papers are about the cross country, but I think we also should do a better job of covering the within country, and also with data from developing countries as well. And then one point that Kelsey actually touched upon now is we need to pay more attention about parsing out the fluctuations. So these movements in happiness or life satisfaction that are just independent from GDP, and differentiate between these fluctuations from actual trends. I think that's all. I rushed a little bit, but maybe there is time for additional discussion here and comments. Thank you very much.